So I've always personally been against the Electoral College because I think it's an outdated institution that ultimately undermines the will of voters, and it's done this on multiple occasions. Now, with that being said, I can rationalize substantive disagreements with my position. People will say, well, Mike, even though it does actually give more power to rural voters, we have to weight their votes accordingly, because if we don't, then they'll be completely ignored by all of the politicians. And I get that. I get reasonable defenses for the Electoral College, even though I disagree. But what you're about to see is not a reasonable defense.
Abolishing the Electoral College, that is the subject of this evening's Talking Points memo. After Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, the left in America is demanding that the Electoral College system put into place in 1787 be scrapped. But there's a hidden reason for this. As we reported, even though Secretary Clinton won the popular vote by 2.8 million, the progressive state of California provided all of that margin, Clinton defeating Trump there by about 4.3 million votes. So if the Electoral College were abolished, presidential candidates could simply campaign in the nation's largest states and cities, New York, LA, Chicago, Houston, and rack up enough votes to pretty much win any election. That's what the left wants. That's what they want. Because in the large urban areas and blue states like New York and California, minorities are substantial. Look at the landscape. Philadelphia, Dallas, Fort Worth, Miami. In all of these places, the minority vote usually goes heavily to the Democrats. Head to that New York City, LA, and Chicago, San Francisco. Don't really have a national election anymore, do you? You have targeted populations. Newspapers like the New York Times and the LA Times have editorialized to get rid of the Electoral College. They well know that neutralizing the largely white rural areas in the Midwest and South will assure liberal politicians get power and keep it. Talking Points believes this is all about race. The left sees white privilege in America as an oppressive force that must be done away with. Therefore, white working-class voters must be marginalized. And what better way to do that than center the voting power in the cities? Very few commentators will tell you that the heart of liberalism in America today is based on race. It permeates almost every issue. That white men have set up a system of oppression. That system must be destroyed. Bernie Sanders peddled that. To some extent, Hillary Clinton did. And the liberal media tries to sell that all day long. So-called white privilege, bad. Diversity, good. If you look at the voting patterns, it's clear that the Democrats are heavily reliant on the minority vote, also on the woman vote. White men have largely abandoned the Democrats. And the left believes this is because of racism, that they want to punish minorities, keep them down. So that's what's really going on when you hear about the Electoral College and how unfair it allegedly is. Summing up, left wants power taken away from the white establishment. They want a profound change in the way America is run. Taking voting power away from the white precincts is the quickest way to do that.
Now, I don't know about you guys, but I really love the underlying irony in this segment, because Fox News is a network that always bemoans how the Democratic Party makes any and every issue about race, but here they are making an issue unrelated to race about race. So I just find it funny overall.
You can't explain that.
He suggests that since it was put into place in 1787, that's a reason to keep it. But if anything, I think that that's an argument that hurts your position, because you're illustrating just how outdated the institution is. So the fact that it existed for centuries, that's not a compelling argument. That tells me that we really do need to look at it and reevaluate whether or not we want to keep it. Saying that something is old and traditional and part of American history is not a compelling argument. Now, he also says, so if the Electoral College were abolished, candidates could campaign in the largest cities and states and rack up enough votes to pretty much win any election. Right. That's what I like to call democracy. Isn't that how it's supposed to be? I mean, when you live in a democratic republic, the goal is to get as much votes as possible. So, I don't get how that's a bad thing to you, and that's in fact how most democracies in other countries work. It's just you get more votes, you win. It's plurality or majority. I don't understand why you think states with a population of 10 people should be able to determine the outcome of the election for everyone else. It doesn't make any sense to me. Someone in a smaller state's vote should not matter more than other people's. That's why we have the House of Representatives, so they can petition their representative in their district for representation. Now, furthermore, if you're a Republican in Oregon, for example, your vote effectively doesn't count because all of our state's electoral votes are going to go to the Democratic candidate no matter what. For me, I voted for Jill Stein. 0 electoral votes went to Jill Stein. But if we didn't have the Electoral College, then my vote would just go directly to Jill Stein, and a vote for Trump in my state of Oregon would go directly to Donald Trump. So you're taking away the voices of some people, and I think that's inherently unfair. Now, he also states, newspapers that advocate for the abolition of the Electoral College, quote, know that neutralizing the largely white rural areas in the Midwest and South will assure liberal politicians get power. You're making this argument now, but if you fast forward a couple decades later, demographics are changing, Bill. That's a fact. There will be less white people in the country in several decades. So what does that mean? That means that if you don't get rid of the Electoral College now, then that will make it more difficult for Republicans to win the White House in the future. For example, Texas is on the verge of flipping. Maybe in a couple decades, they're going to be a blue state outright. Now, other states might flip and become red states, but as far as we know, as it stands, if Texas does in fact become a blue state, that's going to be really difficult for Republicans to ever take the White House back. So you're making this argument now, but I guarantee in a couple of decades, you're going to change your story and you're going to say, no, we need to abolish the Electoral College. And then he states, the left sees white privilege in America as an oppressive force that has to be done away with. Therefore, the white working class voters must be marginalized. And what better way to do that than center the voting power in cities? Okay, nobody's calling for white working class voters to be marginalized, Bill. You made that up. You pulled that out of your asshole. And furthermore, you're trying to make this about race when real liberals are calling for class equality as well as gender and racial equality. If you're against that, you're just an asshole. Do you honestly think that some demographics in the country should have more political power than others?
You can't explain that.
As liberals, we're calling for equality of all groups. Whites, blacks, gays, straights, it doesn't matter. We think that regardless of your political identity, regardless of your sexual and racial and gender identity, that you should be able to have the same political power, the same voice as everyone else. That's what makes us liberal. The fact that you're basically inadvertently admitting that you think that white voters should have more power, it's a little bit telling, don't you think? He then talks about how the left makes every issue about race and how Bernie Sanders peddled that, and to some extent Hillary Clinton did. Look, this is really ironic to me since you're turning a discussion about abolishing the Electoral College into one about race. Maybe you should look in the mirror when you talk about things like this, Bill. The fact is that many white people live in cities as well, Bill, and in many large cities, the white population is actually growing. But I mean, in the end, none of this even matters. We should evaluate the efficacy of the Electoral College with respect to its impact on democracy, and not gauge whether or not it helps or hurts one group or political group or demographic over the other. What we should do is look at these political institutions and determine whether or not they're fair or unfair. And when you look at the Electoral College, I don't see how you conclude that it's fair. I mean, even if you admit that it's important for rural voters to have a larger say in elections because they would otherwise get steamrolled by larger cities, I understand that, but that's still inherently unfair. You're giving some people a louder voice than others in a democracy. And the whole premise of democracy is one person, one vote. So the Electoral College takes away from that. So I get the rationalization for wanting to keep the Electoral College. But when it comes to the defenses of the Electoral College, this is definitely one of the worst I've seen.
Tide goes in, tide goes out. You can't explain that.
Support this podcast by joining the independent progressive media revolution today at humanistreport.com.